We'll get into it. All right, I guess we're live now. So, welcome everyone to the Wizard of Radical Self Respect. My name is Jared Mello, and this is interview number 5 of my Survivor series. And I wanted to make sure I don't pigeonhole myself into just talking about people who have been through relationships with a narcissist. And that's why the guest today is a mental health advocate. His name is Joe Spector, and he's got an interesting story that I'm really curious to dive into. But thank you very much for coming on the show today, Joe. How are you?
I'm doing fantastic, and thank you for having me.
My pleasure. My pleasure. And again, I think what you're doing is pretty awesome. We were talking before we went live here about some of your story and how you've gotten to where you've gotten, but perhaps you can take us to the beginning of your Instagram page and what got you started on becoming a mental health advocate and talking about PTSD, self-deletion, etc.
It's a bit of a lengthy story, and it starts way before Instagram. Should we go back to the beginning?
Sure, sure.
Okay. At 21 years old, I became a police officer, and I did that for about 3 years before deciding that I loved the adventure, but I didn't really dig on the conflict so much. And I hustled and transferred over to the fire department. And prior to that, though, I got into a really bad car accident on duty in the police department, and I cracked the side window with my head. I had a traumatic brain injury, and I herniated some discs, and I had some permanent neurological conditions from that. Fast forward, I was on the fire department for 12 years almost, and was just about to promote to captain. I'd worked my way up the ranks from firefighter to engineer, and I was about 3 months away from my captain's promotion. And I was on a call at a golf course where we had treated a nosebleed patient, and we were helping her husband out, showing the husband how to follow the ambulance to go tend to his wife. And I was kneeling on the ground, putting our heart monitor cords away and disinfecting it. And the elderly gentleman, kind of heavyset gentleman with a golf bag, he fell on top of me, and he just landed just his whole body while I was kneeling down on my neck, and it kind of cranked my neck where I already had those herniated discs and that neurological stuff going on. And it was so weird. It was like we were preparing for my promotional ceremony one second, and then every doctor I went to said, "This is permanent. You're going to need surgery. There's no going back on the fire truck." And what I have is called dystonia. With that first head injury, it damaged a part of my brain that controls motor neuron stuff. So I go get these Botox injections from the neurologist, but my face spasms a lot. My eyes spasm shut, and there's all these weird symptoms that were they weren't dormant, but they were put in check during the previous 10 years. But then that golf bag hitting my head and the injury to my neck just flared them up, and it's permanent, it's progressive, it's going to get worse. And my doctors or the fire department doctors wouldn't clear me. And so I, all of a sudden, right, instead of getting promoted, I medically retired. And it was like everything kind of, I've been working my butt off to learn how to be a supervisor. They had given me my own fire truck, my own crew. I was like living the dream. It was awesome. And I was having like my highest income. And then all of a sudden it was like, got 10 different doctors telling me what surgeries to have. Instead of being like superhero firemen, my kids are like confused because dad's just home all the time. I can't pick them up anymore because my neck hurts. I can't even watch Netflix half the time because my eyes are locking shut. My income has been cut in half. And shortly before that happened, my grandmother died in the same week that my dog died. And I'm like a dog. My dogs are my people, you know? And so I was experiencing already some grief when that happened. My mom had dementia and was no longer recognizing me or my kids. So it just like this snowball of kind of, prior to all of that happening, I had like a Norman Rockwell family. I was like the fireman. My wife is a teacher. Our kids are healthy and happy. Like everything is going well. And then all of a sudden it was just like everything got upended. And in addition to that, the day I medically retired, one of my very best friends since childhood died. I'm going to quick trigger warning. Will be careful with my verbiage, but I talk about a lot of death and trauma moving forward that happened to me, death of loved ones and things of that nature. So just wanted to kind of warn anybody, but
Sure.
yeah, I was leaving City Hall. I'd got my medical retirement. My wife and I were like crying in the car. So career was gone. And then get the phone call that one of my very best friends on the planet just died in a car accident horrifically, and that same day, and all of that other stuff had been happening, and it was just a mess. Then a couple of weeks later, another one of my friends, good friends since childhood, died of an overdose, totally unrelated, and it just
How
started
old are
stacking
you at
up.
this point?
I was 35, I think, or 30, 36. No, I was 30, almost 37. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
Hold on. Let me do the math on this. It was 2017. I was 35.
Okay.
I was 35. I had, yeah, the very end of 2017. I was about to turn 36 when all this happened. Sorry. It's a lot of stuff happened during a year or
Yeah,
two.
it sounds like it.
It got worse. My mother-in-law had cancer and passed away. It was like every 5 seconds we were sitting down at the table with our children who were little at this point, like maybe 3 and 4, telling them another loved one passed away. The dog passed away. You can't go to grandma's anymore. My mom is acting aggressive with her dementia, not her fault, but like, weird symptoms. So kids couldn't be around her anymore. Then their other grandma passed away, and then dad's not a fireman anymore. It was a mess. And I was kind of trying to, keep my composure and do what I do, which is like face everything and maintain a semblance of normalcy in my family. But it was falling apart. Like, I'm giving you the Cliff Notes version, but we were all really struggling, and my kids were having a very hard time. When my dog died, it melted me down, but my daughter was crushed. She was like 5, and then her grandma died, and then both of my wife's grandparents died. So her great grandparents died. My grandma died, which is my kids lost all of their grandparents in like 1 year, grandparents and great grandparents. And my wife and I were trying, this is the same year their dad's no longer a fireman, all this stuff just piling up.
That's a lot.
It was suffocating. And I had never experienced really anything like that to this point. So it was like, it was intense. And, I have a lot of mental fortitude, and I'm a pretty healthy, happy guy at this point, but you can only take so much. And
Sure.
um, my wife started drinking a lot. I have permission. She and I both share our journey. So she's online and on my page sharing and stuff. So her coping mechanism in that case was drinking a lot. Mine was really just kind of like trying to hold it together and survive, but I couldn't even grieve because like I went to 2 different counselors who told me, I don't really know how to help you because you're doing all this work and you're doing EMDR, but like every new visit, there's a new death to process. And we haven't even started the grief process on the other one. It was just really complex. And the counselors were telling me they couldn't help me. And my daughter was probably like 6 at this point. Now we've lost 2 of our dogs, all of her grandparents. Mom is drinking, dad's not a fireman. She started having like major emotional struggles, big time challenges,
Sure.
which is like totally understandable. My kids, their life was totally upended. And we started getting into different counselors with her, and they were really stressing emotional regulation and taught us how to grieve with a child and how to help her process her feelings. And so we were kind of working on our own feelings, and I was in counseling, and I was sitting at the table with my daughter doing grief work and all these exercises. And I learned a lot about emotions for children and adults are the same. Like, the children need you to regulate, put a name to your feelings, all the tools that work for adults too, right? So I was learning about my own emotions while I was teaching my kids and in these counseling sessions. But quite honestly, every day I woke up and I was like, I don't think I can take anymore. I'm at my tipping point. And every night I went to bed, I was like, I can get through this one more day. I have a good positive self-talk. And every day I started getting triggers, like because I got so many death notifications. Every time the phone would ring, I was getting, you're talking about a guy who could like maintain composure on a house fire, no problem. And now the phone rings and I'm like having physiological responses. It was starting to get unsustainable. My wife and I were getting real disconnected because she was having a hard time coping with everything. And it just went on like that for like almost 2 years. Just every day felt unsustainable, and I pushed through and I pushed through. And I might be missing or skipping some things, but the gist of it is, one day, and this is like my trigger warning here, and I'll be careful with my verbiage, but like one day I think my body and my mind, I pushed so far past my threshold that finally it caught up with me, because everybody has a breaking point no matter what. And I went temporarily insane, truthfully. I ended up in a parking lot, like I'm parked here. I was in my car. I have no recollection of how I got there. I'm just in an empty parking lot. And I'm going to get a little emotional when I talk about this. I'm comfortable speaking about it. It's very important to me to do so. And I'm measured with it, but I still get a little bit of a response because I have to kind of take myself back there.
Totally fine.
I was like, I was broken out in hives. I was like hyperventilating. I had a loud ringing in my ears. I felt like my heartbeat felt like somebody was hitting me in the chest with a sledgehammer. It was physiological, physical, mental, and emotional, just like entirely broken down. And I felt like I was drowning, like I needed to come up for air. And I had a firearm in my hand, and I was like fighting with myself. It's very hard to explain. For sure, like I think you hear a lot of people say self-deletion is selfish, or like what were they thinking. I'm here to tell you, as somebody who almost did it, the rational thinking mind is gone. The last thing I wanted to do was leave. 100%. I was crying, like fighting with myself, because I felt like I needed to do this,
Right.
but I also didn't want to leave. I didn't want to abandon all the things that are my responsibility, my team. I don't tap out. I have my family, but like it just like, I almost felt like if you have your hand on a stove and you have to pull it off, I needed to get, my body and my mind were telling me, you have to get out of this. This is no longer sustainable. It was very, very weird and very hard to explain, but the thinking mind is gone and you're just like in torment. And I was like wrestling with myself, contemplating doing it, bringing it back down, bringing it back up. And eventually I had it in my mouth, and had pressure on the trigger with my finger, and I was crying, and I didn't want to die, but I felt like I had to. Very paradoxical and conflicting. And eventually I just was able to, I have no idea how I was able to just take one big deep breath, just like a meditative breath, like when I'm meditating. And I was able to get the gun out of my mouth, like I had been wrestling with myself. And I felt like I kind of came back to myself for a minute, and I threw it in the glove box. And it was so bizarre. It was like it was dynamite. Like I couldn't get away from it fast enough. All of a sudden it shifted to where like I needed it. And then it was like, oh my gosh, I cannot get away from this fast enough. I propelled myself out of my Toyota 4Runner and like fell on it. I was like physiologically like trying to escape the firearm, because I like felt like it just almost killed me, even though it was me. Sure. It's very, very hard to explain. And I just fell on the ground. Boom. I hit the ground so hard. And I was just like, started throwing up. I was like sobbing. I knew I didn't want to die, but I didn't know how to live. And I just like, I knew I was at a breaking point. Like I was entirely broken. And I called a firefighter friend of mine after I collected myself, and I told him, hey, like I just almost self-deleted. That's not the word I use, but I said, will you take my gun? And like I went over to his house. He lives by me, and he took it and he hugged me, and we cried, and I got home. I don't even really remember how I pieced myself together, and I must have gotten showered up or whatever. And I told my wife what had happened. And I basically told her, like, this is no longer sustainable. I can't end my life, and you can't keep drinking, and we need to figure this out. Like we need help. And so she ended up doing a lot of research and checked herself into an outpatient facility. And so proud of her. It's very hard for her. She unpacked all of her childhood trauma, and that's like, she did so much work over 3 months, like intense. Sober, she hasn't drank in 3 or 4 years, however long it's been. That was 2020, so 3 years. Just quit, like went to rehab and got healthy. It was amazing. And I called my old counselor, who I had done some counseling years ago on the fire service stuff. Oh, I didn't even, if I can backtrack for a minute,
Sure.
You had asked me about PTSD, and that's where this got started. When all of these deaths and things started happening, I had never had any PTSD on the fire service. I've run so many bad calls, from drownings to drive-by shootings. And all of a sudden, I think because my psyche broke from all of the grief and the trauma, calls that I hadn't even remembered about, I started having these visceral flashback, like nightmares where they were like, I don't want to say lucid dreams, but I was like in them. And I'm like working on this pediatric patient who's drowning. And then all of a sudden their face would be one of my kids. And then I would wake up gasping. This was happening like every night. I was having like, that's where the workplace PTSD, it wasn't really caused by that, but it was like, hey, I'm joining the party now too. And all of this other stuff happened, and my brain just broke, it was terrible. All this years of stuff just like it. And so I hit that tipping point. I went home. I called my counselor, who I hadn't talked to in years, who had helped me with some fire department stuff. And I was like, I need help. I need help. And I got back into therapy with him, and he's retired now, but he's amazing. He helped me so much. And my wife was kind of like absent because she didn't live there, but she was like 8 to 9 hours a day in the therapy and in these groups and doing all this stuff. And so it was the summertime. She's a teacher. I would go to my therapy, I'd go to my physical therapy, and then I'd have the kids all day, and we would be working on emotions with my children too, because of all the struggles that I had shared with you, grief and different things. And so we were all just like, as a family, we were broken, but we're healing too,
That's pretty impressive though, too, to have you all on the journey like that at the same time together. How do you work on emotions with your children like that? I think how do you do it?
Well, to fast forward now, it's like amazing because it was so painful, but like my kids are so emotionally sound. They even help their own friends with it. Like it was, what I did was like, I listened to everything that their counselors taught me, which was integrating and lining up with what my wife was learning and with what I was learning in different ways. It's all the same. And so I had my kids at home, and their counselor was guiding me on how to, like, in an age appropriate way, work through grief and cry in front of them, not too much, but enough, and to give labels to their feeling, put a narrative to their story. So like with our dogs, it's helpful for adults and children to tell your story, like I'm doing here, right? Like we heal as we do this. And so, and to put labels to your feelings. I feel grief. I feel embarrassment. I feel shame.
That's
so
hard too. It's hard to label it sometimes.
It is. It's crazy. My kids had the wheel of emotions. I had the wheel of emotions. My wife had the wheel of emotions, just learning our emotional vocabulary together. And my kids, I'm honest with them. I'm telling them I'm learning as I'm teaching you, and we would do like picture books where they would tell their story about, like, it was heartbreaking too. Like they would draw, like when we told them that the dog was passing away and they had to go to their aunt's because the vet was coming over, or like all the stuff I walked through. I don't want to get into right now, but helping my children walk through their story and be in a safe space for them to tell their story. And we cried a lot together. And then my wife would come home and we would connect, and I would split it up. It was like an hour of emotional work, and then we'd watch like a Marvel movie or something, like a kid appropriate. And then like we would do kids yoga and meditation. I would be doing my own yoga and meditation at the rehab facility. My wife was doing that. And then I found a bunch of like emotional yoga and meditation that were age appropriate. And so we'd do some emotional work around the table together. And then we'd watch a movie and break it up. And then we'd do some yoga and meditation. And that was like our summer. Like we were just all in therapy. And we did a lot of healing, and we learned so much. And I learned how I'm like a very, very like ambitious person. Like I go big or go home on everything. Sure. And I like when I promoted to captain, like I was like crazy. When I got hired by the fire department, I was like #1 on the list. Well, I took all of that drive and like was like, this is my new mission now, like to get healthy emotionally. I want to nerd out the way I do on emotions, and I want to save my family. You know what I mean? And so I nerded out, dude. I read textbooks on life deletion recovery. I don't know how to say that on here, but you know what I mean? Like, but like textbooks, like coursework, like on post-traumatic growth. And then I was taking mindfulness master classes that I paid for on meditation and how to regulate your emotions and help with your pain. I was buying all these books that the counselors recommended for helping your kids with emotions. And I like put myself back to school, like when I was in college, and I was just like 24/7, just studying and healing and trying to listen to what my wife was learning. I was reading her binders from her rehab facility and just trying to take it all in. And I learned so much. How I meditated a lot. Like I a lot of people, it's crazy when I tell them this. I meditate like an hour a day, not as a chore. It's my sanctuary. Like that is where I go to soothe my nervous
That's
system.
impressive. It's a
To,
while.
not in a row. Like I'll do
Okay.
like 5 minutes in the morning, 20 minutes in the afternoon, 20 minutes before bed, but it's
Even
like,
so, that's still an accomplishment. It's hard
it's
to
my,
sit still like that. It's hard.
well, I worked into it, like I wouldn't now it was uncomfortable at first and now I crave it because
Right.
it's how I can relax my face and my jaw. And when your children are dysregulated, the best thing that you can do for them is like get calm. It's like when a sneeze is contagious, your calmness is contagious through mirror neurons. So like
Absolutely.
learning how to like not fight them when they were crying or aggressive, but like let them know like you're safe and I'm here and show them this is what it looks like to breathe and relax and let's put a name to that and can I sit with you in this and all of these unconventional things that nobody teaches you when you have kids that like but I kind of had to learn it because my kids were melting down every day and I was
Sure.
melting down and so it's like I just leaned into healing and just trying to I didn't ever want to feel that way again. And it was just, I'm summarizing, this was like a year of healing and I was in
Right.
EMDR and I was doing all sorts of therapy together too. But we just like, we made it our mission as a family and to heal. And we did, it took a couple of years and we started climbing our way out of it. And then all of a sudden it was like, because of all that, like they taught us like we learned healthy conflict resolution from my wife. We learned so many from the kids counselors, from my counseling, from my wife's place. We learned this like comprehensive life mastery. Like we know how to ask for space and how to not attack or defend, but to say like, hey, when this happened, I felt that way. I'm sorry you felt that way, or like, can I sit with you in this? And just like empathy and like labeling feelings and all these things that like as a firefighter, we should have been taught in the academy and nobody teaches this.
Sure.
And so, um,
I mean, a lot of adults can't even do that either. They can't
no,
like do that without being defensive or saying, "Hey, when you did this, I felt this," kind of thing. People of all ages struggle with that. But before you go on, I want to do a little summary really quick for people that have just gotten here. So basically, you lost your kids lost all of your grandparents in the span of 1 year. Your mother what wasn't dead, but she had Alzheimer's and she really turned into a different person. And that can be almost harder than death sometimes, seeing them
it's
there
so
but
hard.
not there. And then dogs gone, your best friend gone in a car accident. And the car accident ones in particular, they get me thinking a lot because that could be anyone on the road on any given day. You just do not know when that one car accident, it could be you where you're gone. So to me, that's like really scary and really humbling at the same time. And then all of this culminated where you had this injury where this older guy fell on you. You weren't able to be a firefighter anymore and you were a captain and you were working your way up in like the firefighter ranks and then you couldn't do that anymore. So you had all this stuff kind of compound. And I guess the culmination was you in your car, gun in your mouth, about to pull the trigger, about to end your life. But something came over you where I guess maybe a restoration to sanity type thing where you couldn't
That's
get
a good way
away
of
from
putting
the gun fast enough. And I know I've had those kinds of thoughts before too. And little sayings helped me. And I know some people don't like the little sayings because they think it trivializes them, but they did help me where things like, oh, ending your life doesn't end the pain, it just transfers to somebody else. Things like that helped me. I know some people don't like that though. They think, oh, that's because like you said, the person who's about to do it, they're not in their rational mind per se at the time, a lot of times. So those little sayings might not come into your head at that point. But for me, they always had. So it did help. It did help me not do that kind of thing. So then after you got restored to sanity, then you and your whole family, your wife stopped drinking, and your children, you all worked together on healthy emotions, healthy conflict resolution. And I guess that's where we are in the story now, because that's not a common story of everyone in the family had some sort of an event and then they're all in a healing process together at the same time. Like that's extremely rare. Like that does not happen very often where it's usually like parents could be some form of unconscious, and then they pass that on to the children, or they're just living out their own traumas and pass that on to their children. But for everyone to be in that same boat like that, that's pretty cool. So let's go into that though. And you said a little bit how you worked on your emotions together and some of the conflict resolutions, but I'm sure there's more. What else? How else did you do it?
Well, you had a great point. I feel like everybody who experiences this, it's probably a different experience for everybody. And so I think it's very important for you to share what has helped you in that situation. And for me, I think that's a big reason why I'm sharing too, because I was just going. I had never had a thought about ending my life ever. Never. That was not even on the table. It was just like, God, how much more can I get through? What are you going to give me today? And okay, I'm going to get through this. I'm telling myself. And then all of a sudden I was like there, and it caught up with me. Like I knew I was in trauma and in crisis, but like that was never even a contemplation. And then I was about to do it. And it was like, that's what really motivated me to start sharing, especially with other firefighters and first responders. I'm sure it can happen to anybody, but
Sure.
particular, we're losing a lot of people and we don't understand why. And then I lived through it, and I'm like, I might have some insight into this from an
Right.
experience standpoint.
Right.
And so I started just sharing my journey with other firefighters and friends, and my wife started sharing her experience and just kind of opening up about the marital struggles and the drinking and the things that nobody talks about. And it was like uncomfortable at first, but it was like we were feeling called, because every time we'd bring up a conversation, somebody else would be like, "Oh, thank you. Can I start talking to you about this?" or crying or whatever. And it was like, "Oh my gosh, why is nobody talking about this?" Like what? It's almost like when we a long time ago, before we had my daughter, we got pregnant and we were so excited, and then we had a miscarriage. And we had never met anybody who had talked about having a miscarriage. And it's a different struggle for the father than it is for the mother. The mother, there's
Sure.
like, it's a loss for both, but it's deep, especially when it's like your first kid. So my wife was in this deep depression, and I was like, not in an unempathetic way, but I didn't know how to empathize with her, and I was young and I wasn't conscious. So I was more like, we'll get this and we'll be okay. And she's like, I lost my child, and I'm like, we'll try again, like it's different. And I was talking to some of the other firemen, this is years before any of this stuff. And all of a sudden, other guys start saying, yeah, like my wife had a miscarriage too, and this was a struggle. And all of a sudden it was like I was flashed back to that, because I was like, oh, this is just one more thing where people don't necessarily talk about it, and it's happening a lot. And when you don't have to be an expert, kind of like how you suggested. When you start just sharing it, it gives other people permission to share too. And then it's like, why am I sitting in a room with 10 firefighters and 7 guys had wives who had miscarriages, and we never even knew it until I started talking. So I had kind of been familiar with that feeling before. So I started talking about everything I just shared with you. And all of a sudden it was like other people started opening up, maybe not about life deletion thoughts, but about depression or PTSD. Or my wife, she's like, we're both individually in her circle. She's having all these people open up and cry and talk about marriage issues and parenting and drinking. A lot of people drinking, and they
Sure.
didn't feel comfortable reaching out for help. And she started pointing them towards resources. And just like all of a sudden our circle, we were kind of like nervous to go back in public and share what had happened to us. And it was like, it was needed. And everybody, all of our friends and our family who we hadn't seen in a long time, like not only were excited that we were kind of healed and back socializing, they were having struggles of their own. And it was just like, all of a sudden this pain we went through was turning into this beautiful thing. And I went on a cruise with some of my firefighter friends, and they did this like trauma thing where they were selecting 3 people to give a talk about a triumph over trauma in this like big Broadway auditorium. And like, I was like, I don't know why I felt really compelled. I've been talking about my story. So I put in for it and I got selected.
Mm.
And a couple months before the cruise, they had this TEDx speaker who trained me over Zoom to like tell my story. And then it was really wild, because I had just kind of come out of it and I had never told my story. And she helped me craft this 15-minute story without all the fluff, being super concise with a beginning and a middle and an end. And I was practicing before I went on that boat with my friends, and I couldn't get through the story without just ugly crying. And I was like, oh my gosh. I called the lady and I was like, I can't do this talk. I at this point, I hadn't shared like openly any of the things I'm talking to you about, select few people, but not like openly. And all of a sudden I started talking about my friends and my career, and I'm like sobbing, and then like the life deletion and my kids hurting. And she's like, just keep, first of all, she's like, I spent too much training you, and like 500 people put in for this and you got selected. You got to do it. Like, we can't get a replacement now. And secondly, she was empathetic, but she's like, just tell it more, practice more. The tears will stop. Like, you might cry a little bit on stage, but like, get it out. Like, this is therapy. And she was right. So like, for like 2 weeks, I practiced this talk every day, and I was like snotting, like ugly crying. And then over time, I could tell it was therapy, like my own therapy. You know, it was like looking in the mirror, telling this story. And then I went on that cruise ship, and I got up in front of 600 strangers on a Broadway stage with like a sound guy putting a microphone in my ear. And I gave this like TEDx style talk. And I just shared like a more kind of emotional and compact version of the story that I just shared with you. I opened up about the life deletion thoughts, my wife's drinking, how we recovered, childhood emotions. And I thought I was doing it for me, but then I couldn't go anywhere on the boat without somebody pulling me aside and saying, thank you so much for sharing. I lost so-and-so to life deletion. My children are struggling emotionally. I'm drinking. Like, it was like, I was like a ping pong ball. Like, people, I was like, whoa, that was what's, to circle way back. That was what started. I got home from the ship and I was like, I should tell my story. Like, I thought I was doing that to heal myself, and all these people are telling me it was helpful. And I'm retired from the fire department. I can talk and I can help people. And it was like a passion project. And I started researching firefighter life deletion, and I learned that it's the #1 killer of firefighters, but we don't train on it at all. It's more likely than any other on-the-job injury to kill you as a first responder. And there is zero training. There's crisis stuff on the back end, reactive stuff, but we're all about prevention and proactive stuff. All of the stuff I learned with my kids, the emotional stuff, none of that is available. And even if it is, the guys don't want to hear a counselor talking about it. So I started a podcast, and I drop F-bombs. I use like firefighter language, and I talk about emotions and feelings, and I cry on there. I share how to write grief letters, all the stuff that it would take me 2 hours to just even summarize. Like, I'm even talking a lot now, but all of the story you're asking me, I share. And all of a sudden I started getting like anonymous, like an Apple review. Like, I'm in my fire station listening to this. It's exactly what I need. And it was just like, it just kind of snowballed. And then my friend who's big on social media is like, you have to market your podcast on Instagram. Like, that's how people will find it. And to answer your question, that is what led me to starting my Instagram page. And then it's just been like 2 years of talking about my feelings and speaking to other firefighters and kind of writing and Instagramming and connecting with people like you. And just, I'm not an expert. I'm just sharing my journey.
Well, I'll tell you what, a couple things that your story is making me think of is, one, just the power of honestly sharing what's going on with you. Looks like you're frozen over there. I don't know if you're there.
Hold on, I lost you. Are you there? I'm so sorry, I lost you.
No, now you're back. You're back.
Okay,
the screen froze there for a second. But I was going to say, so what your story is making me think of is a couple things. One, just the power of sharing honestly and openly. That is something that I originally learned that from like AA and NA, because that's what they do there, right? What they do there has helped my life so much in just taking some of the lessons I learned from that and applying it today. The honest and open sharing part, because if you had to guess or say something like the difference between you now and you before, and many other firefighters and many other people before, if there's a big difference, I would say it's probably the lack of honest sharing about what they're thinking and feeling. But what do you think is the difference?
I think it's exactly what you described, but I also think I can't speak for everybody, but I can speak for my experience as a first responder. I think there is a lack of honest sharing because there's a fear of reaching out for help and sharing. But the more I got into this, I think there's a lack of an awareness that we even have these feelings, or we're even struggling. And my breed, they like breed it out of you, and they condition it out of you. And so like, I if you would have talked to me 10 years ago before all this happened, I'm not a mean guy. I wouldn't have laughed you out of the room, but I would have been like, I don't have feelings. I don't need to talk about this stuff. What are you talking about? Like,
Right.
that's where most of us are at until they tap into it and they write that grief letter or they go do the counseling. And then it's like, all of a sudden it's like, or until that they hear honestly from their wife that they're withdrawn and they're angry. And then all of a
Right.
sudden, like, they have feelings and they come out loud and clear, and then they're overwhelmed by them. And that's where I think the PTSD and the life depression, life deletion stuff comes
Sure.
in,
Sure.
because it's, of course, everybody's a human and they're stacking up stuff left and right, but they're not only uncomfortable sharing it, they're not even aware that it exists.
Mm. Now, what is a grief letter, by the way?
So, one of the things, like you had mentioned, what helped you, there's different methods of, healing in this arena. One thing that was exceptionally, like, one of the biggest game changers for my healing was expressive letter writing. And so, for example, like my mom, who I mentioned, well, she passed away about a year ago. Like, I will write letters to her regularly, and it sounds so weird, like you're writing a letter to a deceased person. Um, but it's remarkable. You There's a formula for it. It's different for everybody, but it's like, you sit down for 20 minutes. You don't really want to do it too much, because you don't want to engage in your trauma too much. You have to be delicate and careful. You need to walk through it. It's like fire, and the only way out is through. But you don't want to
Mm.
sit in it for 2 hours. You have to be healthy about it. And
Well,
so
what's the guideline for doing that part? How do you know when you've had too much? I think that's
the
important for people
guideline,
to
based
know.
on just a couple of different, like, books that I read and counselors who talked to me, is like, you set a timer for 20 minutes, and whatever trauma has been on your heart or on your mind the most, or whatever your most recent loss is, you just free flow write. And you can dictate, you can handwrite, you can type, whatever, but it's not, you don't care about punctuation. You're tapping into, like, your inner child raw feelings. So, like, I'll write something, like an example, like one that I recently wrote that was just, I didn't plan it. It was just on top of my head. It was like, I got home from dropping my daughter off from school, and I was like, "Hey, Mom, I miss you. Sophie looks just like you, and I love it so much, but it's so hard too." Like, you're
Right.
talking to your loved one, or you can do it to your own inner child. Like, one of the things is, I wasn't aware of how unnurtured I was, until, neither was my wife, until we started unpacking our childhood. So then you can write letters, like, to your younger self, like, you experienced X, Y, or Z, and you shouldn't have, and you didn't deserve that, and you should have
Powerful.
been protected, or anything like that. Hold on one second. I lost the Bluetooth audio here, and I'm trying to. Can you hear me? Okay.
Yep, I can still hear you. Are you able to hear me?
I am. Hold on one second. I apologize.
No, that's okay.
Let me try these here. How about now?
Yep, you're still good. Can you hear me?
Hold
Maybe
on one
not.
second. Yes. One last try. How about now?
Yep, I hear you. Can you hear me?
All right. I can't get the headphones to work. It's just very quiet.
Ah, okay.
It's coming from my phone audio. Like, the Bluetooth separation ended, so it, like, wants me to be. But either way,
I see.
um,
Are you hear me
so
now, though?
I can hear you. It's just very faint, but I'll make it work.
Okay.
And so, um, so you sit down for 20 minutes and you write whatever you can from the heart. Sometimes it's very obvious what you need to write. Sometimes you sit down and you write, and no feelings come out at all. It's an exercise. And sometimes it's like the most impactful guttural tears. Sometimes you're like, oh, that one was kind of like, I didn't have my emotions weren't brewing up and nothing came out. But you set aside 2 or 3 days a week to write for 20 minutes, and you delete the letter, you burn it, you delete the document, whatever, going into it, and you do it when nobody's home. So it's like your permission to be really raw and, like, walk through that stuff, and nobody's going to see it. And then you read the letter out loud afterwards, and the tears come, and then when you're done, you do like a 5 minute, like, loving kindness meditation, where you, like, kind of soothe yourself, because you're into fight or flight. You're tackling your trauma in your mind, which your body doesn't know whether it's real or not. And so you kind of tell yourself, like, you're safe. I was just doing an exercise, like, we were healing. Like, it's weird. You have your inner monologue and you hijack it and you kind of nurture it the way a parent would nurture a kid. And boy, over time, that was just there's so many letters to write, but it was so
Sure.
healing. Like
I
all of a
bet.
sudden I can talk about this stuff, and like, yeah, the tears kind of come, but it doesn't really hurt when I talk about it. It's been
Processed.
reprocessed, you know?
Yeah. So I think writing like that is one of the most powerful things to do. Whether it's a grief letter, talking to your inner child, talking to a younger version of yourself, whatever it is, that is where the healing is at. That's where you get the
Same.
awareness. That's where you like able to identify what you're feeling, what you're thinking. I think of all the things, that's probably my number one. Number two, and a close number two, is probably the meditation stuff, where you just sit still, which is a challenge in itself today with all of the distractions we have with our smartphones, all the social media pings. But to just separate from it for a minute and you do it an hour a day, I think that is probably priceless too. But those two things, humongous. And then that carries over into your relationships with your wife, your relationships with your children, the relationships with other friends, other firefighters. And I think it helps them the most because you have you first, right? You have a good relationship with yourself and your feelings and your emotions, and then it stems from there. But it starts with you, is what I would say.
100%. It can't pour out from an empty cup. That's a
Right.
cliche for a reason because it's true. And the meditation has been absolutely game changing for me. Emotional processing, whether it's through those expressive letter writings or learning the emotional vocabulary or doing those exercises, and a daily meditation practice, are two of the foundational building blocks in that proactive mental health training that I do with the firefighters. It's those two things. If I could convince anybody to do like 15 minutes a day, like 10 minutes of meditating and 5 minutes of emotional work just a day, the cumulative effect of that on nurturing yourself and, like you said, healing yourself so that you can pour out and relate and heal to others. And you meditate enough, you get muscle memory. Like your kids yell at you or your wife or whoever, you can come to your breath and relax your body and create a little space and choose how you want to respond to your loved ones. You can't get there naturally, but over time, if you meditate for like 10 minutes a day every day, it's amazing. What there's so much power in that. It's incredible.
You're able to have that gap, right? The gap
Yes.
where you can take a step back and choose how to respond rather
Boom.
than react. And that's, I
Exactly.
think, where a lot of people are. They're in that react mode where they have the hairpin trigger and something triggers them and they're just poof, like the first thing that comes to their mind is what they're saying. And oftentimes it's like touching on, as Eckhart Tolle would say, like a pain body type thing or some other form of unconsciousness. But I think that step back is humongous and it's hard, but I think meditation is where you really learn to do that. And that's where you're able to
Yeah.
separate yourself from, and then also the meditation, I think, even helps the initial reactions anyway, where like you don't have that initial jolt if you start meditating long enough, right? You're like, oh, okay. You're able to kind of integrate better. And then, you show up as the best version of yourself. You show up as a better version of yourself, which I think is amazing. Now, everyone else out there, I guess there's a lot of unconsciousness in the world today. And what else do you think is getting in the way of people? Because I think on one hand, there's so much awareness right now on Instagram, and there's people talking about this stuff. But there's also plenty of people who aren't talking about this stuff as well, I guess. But what do you think is preventing them? Or what do you think are the barriers to people doing this work?
I love everything you said, and I love Eckhart Tolle, and that is the pain body sneaking up on you
Yeah.
100%. And I think I'll answer your question in a second, but I wanted to just tack on with everything that you just said with responsiveness versus reactiveness. A lot of people don't necessarily want to do this work until that moment that you choose how you want to respond and you shift and you're so used to being reactive is so empowering. To know that you can control your emotions is like becoming a Jedi, and it feels so amazing. And so I think if you do the work and you start to experience that, like when somebody cuts me off in traffic, the fact that I'm just like, whatever, and I get back to the music, like that's amazing. I don't have to tense up and get mad and ruin my drive. Like that's empowerment big time.
Right.
But I think a lot of it is I would guess it's like nobody taught me how to do this stuff, and I was modeled the exact opposite of processing my feelings and nurturing myself and self-care and all the people pleasing stuff. That I think that might even been a post that we first connected on there, like conditioned to suppress myself and be a people pleaser and not have conflict at any cost. And like I don't know, there's the world is, it's like Eckhart Tolle talks about it. There's a conscious awakening, but there's like generational unconsciousness and trauma.
Yeah,
And
sure.
so um, there's not a huge culture of modeling and teaching how. Like I'm so thankful, like my kids, I don't know how they'll turn out, and I'm sure I'm making lots of mistakes, but they can definitely, they won't be sitting across from a counselor saying like, my parents shut my emotions down and told me it wasn't okay to cry and I didn't feel safe to be authentically me. I know that. Like
Right.
we're changing it, you know what I mean, a little bit, inch by inch. But and like conversations like this is amazing, two dudes talking about all of this stuff. But like this is not the norm. And this 10 years ago, like it's interesting. I'm getting invited to speak at the fire departments now. 10 years when I started, even 2 years ago, I started the podcast because it was like, I'm going to have to broadcast this and force it down their throats. But there's some sort of shift that's happening where like enough people are hurting, which I think is like what happened with me and my family. Like that's the catalyst for growth, right? Or I don't know, like enough cool people who are regular, quote unquote, are just opening up and talking. And so like in this particular case, people can watch this and go like, hey, two regular dudes are talking about emotions. Maybe that should be normalized. But the barrier to that, I think a lot of people are very uncomfortable being introspective and recognizing like they don't want to hear that they're yelling at their kids and it's causing trauma and that they have to do work. I mean, I'm not a pick yourselves up by the bootstraps guy at all. I'm an empathy for trauma guy, but like there's work involved. You got to work your
Okay.
ass off, excuse
You
my
made me
language,
think.
to
Two things I think really get in people's way now that you're mentioning it. One, the inability to admit fault and admit when you're wrong. I think that's a big one that gets in people's way, and they don't know how to be humble about the things they've done wrong or things they've done could have done better. I think that's a major stumbling block for one. And then two, you reminded me of this when you were talking about being able to control your emotions. I think there's so many stages of recovery, right? And so if you try to talk about a stage 2, 3, or 4 concept to someone who's in stage 1, they might get upset. So like someone that's hearing, oh, you can control your emotions, they might think, so you're saying to me when this person is gaslighting me or doing this, or this, that I can control what I'm thinking or feeling? They might not be ready to hear that at the time. Ultimately, I agree with you. Like eventually you do get to that place, but you got to meet everybody where they are, right? So when you meet them where they are, then you can lead them through to where they need to be. So I'm not sure, like with what you talk about, where the stages come into play. Like normally I talk a lot about narcissism stuff, and the healing for that process is there's things I would tell somebody that's in a stage 4, like they've done, like, oh, they worked on their own side of the street, realized they could have done things better, maybe let go of resentments for the people that were unconscious or had narcissism in their life. I would say to those people something different than I would say to the person who is struggling to even break free, struggling like in a trauma bond with them and just trying to get out, because it wouldn't go over very well. Like what I would say to someone in stage 4 could be like gaslighting to someone in stage 1. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is because I think it just might be one of the things that stops people from entering the process. So my philosophy is validate, but then also guide them through. So you need both steps. Some people are heavy on the validation, no pushing or guiding and leading them out. Others are the opposite. They are completely personal responsibility. It's all your fault. Pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And I think there's a place for that. But you also need the validation piece too. So I try to do both. That way you get everybody. Like, oh, yeah, I understand what you're feeling. But let's also take a look at it this way too. I'm not going to, because I won't tell anyone their feelings are wrong. Right? That's a lot of people do too. They'll say, "Oh, you're wrong for feeling that way." It's like, are you really wrong? It's like, no, whatever you're feeling, I tell people, own it. Own your feelings. And when you share honestly, you'll be able to help the most amount of people. And most importantly, you'll help yourself. And it's like Ralph Waldo Emerson said, when you truly try to help other people, you will also always help yourself as well. And I found that to be super true, because I think anyone who's doing what we're doing, whether it's on Instagram, a podcast, or YouTube, it's therapy for me too. When I'm sharing about what's going on and talking about, like, honestly and openly what's going on, that's therapy. Like, that is healing work in and of itself. You're like, you release what's going on inside of you. So all of this stuff, I think it's connected. Like, whether it's the narcissism stuff or the mental health stuff, PTSD, CPTSD, all of this is connected. And the solutions for all of it, they're very similar too, right? Whether it's mental health, addiction, a narcissistic, the solutions the same. Like, the work is going to be the work. The function of the work and why you're doing the work might be different, but the actual work, like the holistic psychologist has that book, How to Do the Work, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the bread, or that's the meat and potatoes of this whole thing. And I think if people are watching this, I would say, like you said, the work, meditation, the work, writing, journaling, being honest with yourself, writing the grief letters, writing letters to your younger versions of yourself, and just making a place so that people's emotions and whatever they're feeling is validated and they feel comfortable saying it. Because for kids in particular, when they have that disconnect where they think, I can't be open with my parents anymore, I
Yeah.
have to start lying to them, or
Yeah.
they're going to jump down my throat for thinking or feeling this. That's the beginning of a bad path. Now, that was my path with my parents. And that's how you go down, like, addiction lane, right? And one guy, Yohari something or other, I can't remember his name, but he always says a good definition of addiction is lack of connection. Like, you're disconnected from yourself, disconnected from others. And I think that's a good definition. And that's why I think the honest sharing and all of that, that's the antidote. You start with that and then take things one little bit at a time, because I think it's easy to get overwhelmed as well in the healing process, right? Where if you try to heal overnight, that's not going to work. That's not realistic. It's a never ending process, for one. But you break it down into little piece, like little bits and pieces, like you said, like 5 minutes of meditation a day. Start with that and then build up from there. Maybe even 60 seconds if you have to at a time.
One
And
breath.
something, yeah, keeping it real simple like that.
Well, one breath you could start with, and then two the next day. It's
Yes.
definitely incremental success over ambitious failure, and lots of grace and empathy and compassion on yourself, for sure, which that's hard for a lot of us to
Sure.
do, but that's especially depending on how we were conditioned growing up, but that's an important thing to learn. I want to ask you a question. When you were going back to, like, depending on where people are at, one thing might be helpful, and yet the same thing might be gaslighting them. Um, I want clarification in case I ever run into this and I'm speaking with somebody, because the last thing I would ever want to do would be to exacerbate them. I
Right.
think, or to exacerbate their pain. So I think if you have a narcissistic family member, this is not my area of expertise, just like from a layperson's perspective, and you have a trauma bond from growing up with them, that's very, very complex and very, very painful. And I don't think it's ever like, oh, yeah, you don't have to feel that anymore. You might always, for the rest of your life, most likely be triggered by them or their gaslighting or the way that they
Right.
undermine you or invalidate your feelings or do all of the things that narcissists do that hurt us, right? But I think universally the work is kind of the same. And if you end up doing a lot of self work or meditation, you might just be empowered to go, oh my gosh, I'm engaged with this person. They send me this text message, my mom or whoever it is, and I'm feeling effing triggered and I don't like this. And I'm regressing into these patterns of making myself feel small. And I'm noticing the love bombing and all of this stuff. And like, I need to go somewhere safe. I need to put this phone down. I need to hold a boundary. I need to break up with them. And that involves a whole bunch of other stuff to be willing or able to see that and to do that. I'm not, it's a hard, long process that maybe you
Sure.
don't ever get to, but I do think the way to get healthy is to empower yourself by nurturing yourself and doing the emotional work. And I don't think you should ever tell somebody, oh, you can control how you feel. Like I've done all this work and I almost can always control like how I feel. Dude, certain family members, I can't be around them because I just know, like, I don't think I'll ever work through not being triggered by their behavior. There has not been amends that have been made. Behavior hasn't been changed. And I start feeling like a little kid again when I'm around them and I feel disempowered, and all this weird stuff that I've worked through for years comes flooding back. Like, I don't think I'm have any expectation of myself to not feel that way or not get triggered, but it's been pretty wild to know that as uncomfortable as it is, I'm aware of it and I've held boundaries and walked away from relationships. And I don't think any of that would have happened if I didn't do the work in baby steps with
Yes.
grace and self-love. Are we saying the same thing, or were we saying something
No,
kind
we're
of
saying the
different there?
same thing. We're saying the
Okay.
same thing. I think what I meant was, I'm trying to think of a specific example. Like, everyone can do better in their own lives, right? Everyone has, like, in most relationships, there's something someone could have done better, even if it was just walk away. Maybe that's the thing they could have done better. But by telling someone to take a look at their own side of the street, in the beginning, they might not be ready for that. Like, in the
And what if they've
beginning,
been abused by, if they've been abused by a narcissist, that's not what you want to tell them either. Like,
right.
somebody who's a victim of abuse, like, yes, for sure, there are things to be done on their side of the street that can empower and protect them, but that would be like a totally dismissive, almost victim
Yes.
blaming type
And
thing to
that's
be
why
like,
I say they got to be ready
yes,
for it. And they got to be in the place where they think, oh, yeah, okay, I'm seeing this pattern in my life that's coming up with different people now. And okay, maybe this is something I got to take a look at. So in the beginning, that wouldn't be something to really say to them, though. Like, you got to meet them where they are, validate them. And there's other examples of this, I'm sure, as well. This is just the one that I think of because it comes up in my community sometimes where I think, okay, like, I know, like, and there's people that come on my page and they're at a further process and they get upset sometimes because I'll post something and they're like, well, I want to give the flip side of this where some people may go too far in the other direction with something. And I say, yeah, you're right. You're right. I just got to be careful because depending on where they are, what you just said could really upset someone. It could really get them like, second guessing themselves and
yeah, you
going
don't want to
back.
do that.
And that's why it's a tightrope act, really, right? Where most of the stuff is like stage 1 or stage 2 stuff that I talk about for that reason. Because if I used to talk about more of the advanced stuff, but that doesn't get anybody's attention, really. Like, you got to talk about stuff like the pain points. What are the pain points?
Yeah.
For you, it's like the self-deletion. That's a big pain point. Mental health, big pain point. Narcissistic relationships, big pain point. You got to get them first, because if you don't get them, you're not going to be able to help them no matter what you do unless they find a way to you. So
That's very true.
It's just things I've learned from doing what I'm doing. And I think you've learned it as well. But it's just one of those things where I just got to be careful. Like, I'm careful with how I say things and who I'm validating, and then helping them to grow too, because I want them to grow as well, right? Just validation, I think, has its limits. I think there's a point where you do need like a nudge, a push in like different, try something different, because if nothing changes, nothing changes. So it's a balancing act, though.
It's very nuanced, and you have to meet people where they're at. And if somebody has just been in the middle of a toxic, abusive relationship and they're coming out of it, and you're like, you got to clean up your side of the street, that's like
Yeah.
way unempathetic and
Yeah.
harmful. But also, if somebody is at this level where they are ready and need to do some work, it's very weird, right? And you don't want to harm anybody, or you don't want to re-traumatize or re-victimize somebody who's been hurt and wounded and victimized. That would be counteractive to everything. It's
Yes.
this weird, like, emotions are very complex and conflicting, and there's space for all of it. Like, a lot of times our abuse is not like, it's not our fault. It's not our fault. Like what we went through in our childhood, not our fault. But also, it is true that if we want to heal from it, it's our responsibility because nobody else
Yes.
can heal us from it. But that's
100%.
not to blame or dismiss. So I don't know. Both are true. And I don't know how to convey that message with love and empathy, but definitely making people feel
Well,
bad is not a good way of doing it. I
exactly.
agree.
Well, you know what I try to do is when I'm in a good spot, I'm able to respond to the people that comment in a way that it meets them where they are too. So if someone has a problem, I'm like, okay, I totally get where you're coming from. And you're right. And then I'll be able to meet them with what they're saying. And I think part of this is social media. We're able to touch so many people that in a short amount of time, all throughout the world, really. This is a new thing. Humans are not used to this kind of reach. And every situation needs to be taken individually. Every person is going to have a little bit of a different and unique situation. All we can do as the creators is, we're talking generally. We're talking a general thing mostly. But each individual person may have a little nuance in each one of those situations, right? So that's the best way to help is the one-on-one, I would say, because you know where that person is. You can tell, which stage they're in. So you're not going to just blast some stage 5 concept at them because you know where they are. But when you're just posting, it's like you're posting to everybody. And
Yeah.
you're bound to offend somebody at some point
Yeah.
eventually. If you're honest, you'll eventually offend somebody or upset somebody. So that's just one of the pitfalls of social media, but you got to take the good with the bad with social media. We're also able to touch so many more people's lives than we ever would have before without it. So it's
It's
just
very
one of the
true.
things to be cognizant of, I guess. But
I
it's
think too,
fascinating topic.
if I was speaking to somebody who was just coming out of or in the middle of narcissistic abuse in a relationship, I would have I would not feel comfortable advising them, to be perfectly honest with you, because that's not an area of my expertise at
Right.
all, or that's not my experience. So in that case, I would be inclined only to offer empathetic listening and to do authentic validating and let them know how sorry I am. And I'm definitely they're a human being worthy of
Right.
love and their feelings are valid and nobody deserves to be abused. And then there's probably other people where it's like that's you talked about like the 101 level stuff. That's why I don't really go super deep on my stuff too much either. Just mostly sharing my journey and the exercises that helped me, but not really telling anybody what they should or shouldn't do. I'm not like a should guy.
Yeah.
I'm just like, whoa, this was a crazy experience. And I think if I, the only thing I'm an expert at is my own experience. So that's the stuff I'm
That's good.
willing to share.
That's very
But
important to note.
what's that?
That's an important distinction because when you share, like, this is my experience, you're not telling
Yes.
anyone what to do or what they should be
No.
doing. You're saying, hey, this is what worked for me. Take
Yes.
it, take what you want, and leave the rest. That's the antidote. And you brought it up
Agreed.
there. That's the way.
Yes.
So that is pretty. And so when you were doing all this emotional work and the grief work, what was the hardest parts about doing that? Like, what was like the uncomfortable points in it that, like, maybe a part of you wanted to run away from or wanted to stop? Like, were there any points like that? Or
Oh, yeah. Yes. Lots.
okay,
Feeling my feelings for the first time was very
okay,
intense. I had never, I looked at the counselor the first time we walked through one of those grief letters and I was like snotting and crying. And I don't think I had cried since I was a little kid. And I'm conditioned to be like a firefighter. And I looked at him literally. This is what I said. I go, what is happening to me? Like I was so unused to feeling my feelings. And he was like so cool. He's like, you're feeling grief and sadness and childhood trauma. And this is how we feel and heal. And it's okay. And he like worked with me through it. And now, like, I start to get testy or I'm reactive or like I look at my daughter and it reminds me of my mom and I'm like, okay,
I told my wife the other day, I got some feelings I need to feel. I need to have a good cry. Like, I'm comfortable with it now. It's painful, but I'm super comfortable with it. After years, no, it was so uncomfortable and so raw and visceral and painful. And like, it's hard to like be disillusioned about your childhood and to really reflect upon where you're at as a human or a parent and what you're giving to the world and to yourself. And you're like, whoa, that wasn't given to me. And then you start unpacking it and you're like, okay, I can love and forgive, but like, that's not cool. And like, was I worthy? Why am I not worthy of that love? And why didn't I get, lots of so much of this that's like super comfortable for me now. All of it was entirely uncomfortable, very painful, but like it was also like if I don't do it, I'm gonna die and my family is gonna fall apart. And that's like
The big one.
so my hand was forced and I'm grateful for it, but not in the dismissive type of like
Right.
be grateful for your pain type of way. I authentically am, but it was very uncomfortable and very painful.
Now you made me think of something else there too. A lot of people, once they get on a healing journey and they get some self-awareness, they struggle with resentment towards people that were unconscious or people that have harmed them. What are the recommendations you have for people in their spot, or how did you deal with it in your own life if you dealt with that?
Okay, I'll tell you. I very rarely get into conflict on social media. I got attacked on this one. So I do want to give a disclaimer that this is just what works for me, okay, on forgiveness and resentments and all that, because somebody I think who got mad at me had been honestly victimized hardcore, and
Sure,
I think
sure.
they misunderstood what I was saying or it triggered them, and that was not my intention, and I don't want to do that moving forward, but
Right.
I too have been victimized, and I will tell you what has helped me, and that's all I'll say
I
on
think
that.
this is a good example of what I was saying before too, whatever it is. So I'm
Yes.
interested to hear.
Okay, so a few things. It's a multifaceted approach. For sure, resentment and anger for me, it's like that Zen thing where you're holding on to hot coals and you're the only one getting burned and you're drinking the poison and expecting it to hurt them. It was only hurting me more and it wasn't making them fix their behavior. It
Totally.
didn't undo what happened to me. And so not only was I traumatized and victimized, but my own emotions and my mind and the mental movies about it and those angry feelings were re-victimizing me over and over again. So forgiveness, they don't like the word, this person. And I kind of met in the middle and said, maybe I wish there was a different word for what I'm describing, but the forgiveness is the only word that I have for it. So what empowered me was to redefine forgiveness. Forgiveness has nothing to do for me with the other person. Forgiveness is like, fuck that. I don't want to live in this anymore. And you fucked me over and hurt me. And you don't get the power to do that anymore because I love myself more. So I'm going to release that. I'm not going to judge you. You were unconscious. There's no way, maybe a narcissist, but even then, like, does a narcissist feel happy and connected and have an authentic, good quality of life? I don't know why they're doing what they're doing and hurting people, but they're not getting hugs at home like I am. You know what I mean? So like
Yeah.
they're disconnected from their self and from humanity, and that's a shitty existence. And so I don't condone their behavior. This is very important. I stand up for myself and I won't subject myself to it anymore. And I hold the boundaries I need to. And that's the equation. Like I'm not letting them keep doing it to me. I'm not okay with it. It's not okay what they did to me, but I can't keep living in it. And that's a process. It's not like a magic way, but that was the intention, the motivation, the mindset, the journals, the writing. I could write FU letters to them over and over again and cry and get angry and punch the punching bag and throw that letter away and rip it up. That was all part of like refiling that and doing EMDR. So like my mindset is I'm not judging them, but it's not like a pious thing. It's
Right.
just like the energy of judging another human being. First of all, I've screwed up. And secondly, that's not helpful for me or my mental health. I'm just trying to focus on the now and on healing. And I know anger, it dumps cortisol, it tenses your muscles, it takes me away from this present moment. And so I worked on having a generous interpretation of empathy, which is truthful. Like my parents did the best they could with what they had, and it was way more effed up for them than it was for me. And that is not dismissing what I experienced. I think that is somewhat of subjective, but that's true. But also, I should have been nurtured, and a lot of things that happened to me were not okay. both can be true. So
Yes.
I'm holding space for multiple realities and multiple perspectives. I'm giving them a generous interpretation for me because it makes me feel light and it makes me feel able to smile and enjoy my kids and my family. And when it comes up, I don't dismiss or deny the pain or the victimization, and I process it. I let myself cry. I tell myself that sucked and you didn't deserve that. I write letters, I do the work. It's a whole mixed bag of all of it. But I don't deny it, but I don't dwell in a resentment just because it doesn't feel fruitful to my own healing. That's the only thing I was trying to share. And I was just answering a question. I don't even shove that view on people, but so I answered somebody's question about how I got there. And so then somebody came onto that and was like, let me up, but I'm not judging them either. I could tell it was coming from a place of hurt. And I actually felt bad that I somehow triggered, their trauma by saying that. And I was really just trying to give an answer to somebody else. I don't know what to say other than that's been helpful for me, but I understand that a lot of people hate that viewpoint and I respect
Right.
everybody's journey.
Well, I would tell you, I think that's a great way to think of it because
Okay.
I say whatever helps you to be the happiest and healthiest version of yourself, I'm all for. And I liked your verbiage with it too. You give them a generous interpretation because that's what helps you the most today. And that's what I'm for. And here's the other thing about it. The people that I see that are in the best place, usually they have a similar outlook than you. Because that's how I choose to see it as well. I think, okay, they probably couldn't help it. It probably happened to them in their childhood and they just passed it on. So it's a generous interpretation, perhaps, but I don't care. It's an interpretation that helps me. It helps me today. And the people that I see that are doing the best, they usually have a pretty similar interpretation, as opposed to the opposite, full of resentment and anger. Like, I just don't see how that really helps people. And I think it's important to note, like you said, more than one thing can be true at once. A lot of people struggle with that. So, yeah, you can say, I'll give them a generous interpretation, like they couldn't help it, but it doesn't mean what they did was right. It doesn't mean what they did was good, right, or whatever, right? Both of those things can be true at the same time. And I think that's important to note as well, because where that person was probably upset on your page, they probably struggle with that part. Like, two things can be true at once. And so they thought, oh no, he's trying to make me forgive someone that doesn't deserve forgiveness in my eyes. And that's why I say maybe forgiveness isn't the right word.
Yeah.
I like letting go of resentment.
That's a good way of putting it. I agree.
So, and because I think people mess up with forgiveness is they think forgiveness means you have to let someone back into your life completely and all that. And I'm like, no, that's not necessarily what it means. It can mean that. It can mean that if they've changed their behaviors and they're doing well. But whatever it is, you forgive for yourself, not for them. Like, you might forgive them and then not let them back into your life. That's a possibility too.
You can love people from a distance without ever letting them back in your life.
Yes. And I think that's a great concept that, again, the people that I see that are doing the best, they have a similar idea and they do something similar in their own life with that kind of thing. And I try to emulate people that I see are doing well. I'm like, okay, what was their thinking? What was their process? Because those are the clues. The clues are in their thinking. The clues are in their process. So that's where it is. That's where it's at.
When my daughter was going through her emotional struggles, she had a lot of aggressive outbursts. And I read a book called The Explosive Child, and it taught that even when children are being really, really aggressive or manipulative or all the stuff that triggers us, which it's okay to share space for the fact that having empathy and loving our kids through it, but also acknowledging that we're triggered because of our childhood and because explosive children are hard to be around.
Sure.
But he said, like, every kid is always trying their best at all times. And at first, when your kid is like breaking stuff and spitting on you, you're like, there's no way she could do better or whatever when this is a new concept. But then the more I read and learned, it was like every child would like to be sitting down at the dinner table having fun and laughing with you. Do you think your kid wants to be in such rate? Like, so it was a paradigm shift for me to know, like, and it's easier for my kids because those are my babies. I could go, yes, of course, they're hurting, right? But like, without excusing the adult's behavior, because adults have culpability and the ability to, affect the behavior. The same can be said. Like, I don't think anybody really like my family members who I'm not a psychologist, but who like I think were narcissistic or have borderline personality disorder, like they're dangerous. I can't be around them.
Right.
But like they're not feeling the connection I'm feeling in my home. It's a miserable, shitty
They
existence.
probably aren't. They probably aren't. But I think like even just that grace that you're giving your children, right? And thinking they're doing the best they can. And then carrying that over to like what we do and to other adults, where some people may come at you with some anger or some hurt or some trauma, but giving them that benefit of the doubt and not
Yeah.
meeting them in that kind of angry or toxic place, but like giving them the benefit and being chill with them a little bit. And I've worked on that because, as you're a creator, you will make people upset at certain times and they might attack you even. And like how you handle that is everything. Right. And I try, instead of meeting them at that place, I'll try to say, you know what, just be cool about it. So, okay, I don't blame you. And let's talk about this real quick. And usually it doesn't take too much for them to kind of snap out of it. And I've made like friends, people that attacked me first, and then I was chill with them about it. And then
frenemies. That's what we call that.
Yeah.
They become frenemy.
Right.
You become friends with them because you know what? You're viewing them as their pain body, not as the person. It's their pain. I found, like you were talking about Eckhart Tolle with the pain body. When my wife was snapping at me when she was drinking, or when my daughter was, I always viewed like we were always a team and we always loved each other. We're fighting the pain. The pain is the enemy. The unconsciousness, the wounds, the hurt is the enemy. Even if it feels like we're fighting with each other, we're not. And I like the way he personifies that pain body, because then you can see that that person who's attacking you online is just another fellow human being, and we're all human beings together. And you're meeting that pain body with empathy and grace. Or you have to balance it so you don't get abused or whatever. I get all of that, but like there's a nuance there, and I think we're very quick to fight fire with fire, but sometimes like you can really make. I've had some incredible connections and bonds coming from conflict like that too. When you offer a little bit of grace, is something that I always like it when it's extended to me. So if I have the ability to, I like to extend it to others.
And sometimes it doesn't take much, right? And like all they need is a little bit of kindness, and the whole energy of the conversation can be flipped.
Yes.
Now, but if I'm not on a good spot, it'll be harder for me to like not match that energy back, which, of course doesn't do much good. But if you give them that little bit of grace, it can go a far, far way. And again, it's not 100%. There'll be some people that'll be upset no matter what you do. They're hell bent on being upset. And like
I'm sensitive too, because of where I was at with my life deletion situation, I always wonder, if this guy coming at me, what if I'm the last person who talks to him? Like, I'd rather err on the side of diffusion and harmony and love and grace. And I know that that's like an extreme viewpoint, but that's my lived experience. And a lot of people, when they're projecting like that onto you, are hurting. They're hurting,
Sure.
And they just need a little bit
They're
of
not
love.
happy. They're not happy. That's for sure.
They're not happy. And you maybe, I don't know, like, people are at tipping points. And sometimes, as long as you're not stepping on yourself to do so, if you can err on the side of empathy, that's what I always say is best.
I think that takes a lot of self-honesty too, right? To know, what can I really put up with? What am I okay with? Where's the line where I'm going to be hurting myself if I continue? Because there's a lot of people who think, oh, I'm a bigger, stronger person than I am mentally and emotionally, so they think they can handle anything and everything. But in reality, they can't. So they put themselves in these situations where they're hurting themselves. And that's the recipe for resentment. But that's why it's so important, the honesty and humility. Okay, what can I put up with? What am I good with for real? And knowing that about yourself is key, because that point will change for everybody. Like what one person might be cool with and genuinely is cool with, another person may not be. And they got to be okay with that. And or, try to work towards whatever, if it's something that you think you should be working towards. But everyone's going to be in a different place. And I think that the honesty and humility is always going to be like the answer. Like, do that, and you can't go wrong if you're honest and humble with yourself. That's the answer.
Yeah, it's not weak to admit when you're having a weak day or you're having a weakness
Sure.
or you can't.
That's strong.
I'm not up for conflict right now. I'm feeling triggered. I'm feeling angry.
Yeah.
I'm feeling
Yeah.
burnt out. Like that self-awareness and that ability to do that to me is integral to connection. That's
Courageous.
one thing my wife and I have really learned is how to like share our feelings. Like I'm having an off day. If I snap at you, I'm sorry. Or like I'm not up for having this conversation right now because I'm not like the best me right now. And
Yeah.
I think that meditation has helped me a lot with that self-awareness, just checking in with my mind and my body and like recognizing those emotional states before they sneak up on me has been really helpful.
Sure. I think just even giving her or you guys giving each other the heads up on that, like, hey, I'm a little reactive today, or I'm not up for conflict today, or something. This just that heads up goes a far way to kind of like smooth out the edge of that conversation, right? When you
Yeah.
show a little bit of, I guess we'll call it vulnerability. It's a hey, or just honesty about where you are that day, and you say, hey, this is where I am. The other person, if they're on your team, which they should be, right? They'll be like, okay, yeah, I understand that. But just those little things, the little things can go such a far way in those intimate relationships, right? This is why I carry these things around all the time, as a reminder to myself that the little things matter. And if you can do the little things right, you can do the big things right. But if you can't do the little things right, you're not going to be able to do the big things right anyway.
I couldn't agree with everything you just said more.
Yeah. So I think that could be a good place to end here, unless you have anything else you really wanted to share or get off your chest.
I think if you can't get the little things right, you definitely can't get the big things right. And even if you can't get the little things right, have grace on yourself because it's a process and a journey for everybody. That seems like a fantastic stopping point. This was a great conversation.
Well, you actually made me think of one more thing.
Okay,
This will be
let's hear
the
it.
end here. What's your suggestions for having more compassion with yourself and not beating yourself up?
I worked through this actually. This was part of my healing process. And I will again just tell you what worked for me was intentionally hijacking my inner monologue and being willing to observe the way I speak to myself internally, because believe it or not, we're all talking to ourselves all day long for the most part, unless you're like into the power of now, like you and I
Sure.
are, if you're the watcher for a minute, you'll see that there's a big inner monologue. And I started did you ever watch Saturday Night Live, Stuart Smalley, where he's like, I'm good enough, I'm smart enough, and doggone if people like,
Yeah.
he's like this motivational speaker. It feels silly, but if you actually, it felt so uncomfortable at first, by the way, especially as a dude, especially as somebody who wasn't really raised this way. I started speaking to myself the way I speak to my own children. So like I will look in the mirror, and I didn't make this up. This is exercises from, there's a book called Love Yourself Like Your Life Depends on It. And you look in the mirror and you tell yourself, like, make eye contact with yourself. It's so weird. I know it's out there, but over time, like a couple times a day, like, you're awesome. You're a bad MFer. I love you. Like, you deserve love. Or like when I get done doing a workout, or like if I hug my kids when they're fighting and I soften up and I like am a rock star with emotions, I tell myself, like, good job, dude. Like, that was hard and you did it. And like for a year that felt really weird. But over time, I don't believe always in fake it till you make it in life, because I'm big on authenticity. But this is one of those ones where I kind of like faked it until I made it, not made it, and it doesn't rhyme if I say made it. And it rewired the programming. And over a long period of time, my habitual internal monologue is like ride or die cheerleader. And it used to be like hater, perfectionist, inner critic. And it was slowly but surely. And that it just changed with being intentional about speaking to myself with the same dignity and love and respect that maybe I wish I would have been spoken to more growing up and that I offered to my children. And it's a practice, it's a workout almost, the way like doing bench press reps are. Like it's uncomfortable and it's weird at first, but those muscles get stronger. And you know, the world is hard on you, and it's gonna beat the shit out of you. And don't work hard not to pile on, because life is challenging enough for all of us. I didn't need one more. I had so much grief and pain thrown at me. I didn't need one more person piling on.
Sure.
And so I kind of worked to negotiate that relationship with myself, but also too, the flip side of that is processing my anger and writing those letters and saying the things that I feel out loud to a counselor or whatever, because I think the two are integral. It's you can't suppress those emotions and tell yourself you're small, you don't deserve to feel these feelings, and then be like, I love you. It's both. You know what I mean? It's like nurturing.
I
A lot
see.
of it I learned from parenting. I don't know. Like, I just kind of parent myself the way I parent my kids.
That, I mean, that's a good way to put it too. The reparenting, right?
Exactly.
Reparenting yourself. So I think that is a good place to end there too. Where can people find you?
I'm on Instagram at the Joe Spector. I'm building a little community there. You and I connect, and it's a safe place to share emotions and be vulnerable and be authentic, and kind of kind of exchange ideas on the stuff that we were talking about today. But that's kind of my hub.
Good, good. And I think you're doing a great job and you're helping a lot of people, firefighters, be able to relate to your message, but anyone can relate to your message because all sorts of people, like you said, they're dealing with this stuff. So I think it's great what you're doing. Definitely keep going. And thank you very much for coming on the show here.
I appreciate you having me. This was an awesome conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. You're very welcome. Thank you.
Okay, bye.
So long, my man.